First of all, I'd like to thank you for having me in your program. Indeed, Egypt has faced many terrorist attacks before, and we lived in a state of emergency for many time. More than 4 years we are suffering from the state of emergency. But President al-Sisi declared the state of emergency this time in order to find out a creative security measures against terrorism, especially after the reports that ISIS is coming from Libya now. They crossed the border between Egypt and Libya, and they came to Egypt in order to make such terrorist attacks. So he needs cooperation between the military and the civilian police in order to put an end to this tragic attacks. Many people in Egypt think that the state of emergency makes some sort of threats to democratization in the country, but we still suffer from terrorism, and the government thinks that it needs such measures in order to fight terrorism.
Florence, these train bombings in Egypt bring back memories of what happened in December. An attack at a Coptic church in Cairo killed 25 people. Islamic extremists have repeatedly targeted Egypt's Christian minority, which makes up around 10% of the population. What do you think is behind this increase in violence?
I think terrorist groups now try to goal or aim Christians in Egypt because they know very well that it is the sensitive element of the Egyptian society. They know very well that if they made any terrorist attacks against the churches or Christians, this will make a very important reaction in the whole world. Because there are many Christians who live in America and in Europe, and at the same time international organizations and international media will control and will talk about this issue. In addition to that, the terrorist groups failed to affect the Egyptian society from Sinai after the attacks the police and the army take against them in Sinai, and also they failed to destroy the Egyptian economy. So they are trying now to search for a new goal, a new aim, which is Christians. Also, during his visit to America, President al-Sisi had many support from the American President Donald Trump, and he also said that al-Sisi succeeded to a great extent to fight terrorism. So they want to say to Trump that al-Sisi is unreliable and he could not fight terrorism or eliminate terrorism from Sinai or from the whole Egyptian society. That's why they aimed the Christian minority in Egypt.
Let me turn now to Florence in Amman. Florence, your take on the reasons behind the surge of violence targeting Copts?
Well, I think it's clear that what's happening regionally is that ISIS is getting squeezed out of the initial strongholds it established for itself. So the battle for Mosul is now almost over. The battle for Raqqa in Syria is about to begin. Their attempt to establish themselves in Sirte in Libya has not been terribly successful. And therefore, as they are being squeezed out from those various other locations, they need a new center of activity. And it's clear that Egypt looks like a fairly attractive one to them. What is also clear is that they have figured out that Egypt's delicate sectarian balance is a good tool for them to deploy in destabilizing Egypt and thereby gaining influence in Egypt via instability. And so we all know that sectarian tensions have been latent in Egypt. We all know that the minority Christian population of Egypt has never felt completely comfortable and does feel somewhat discriminated against and defensive, and therefore they are playing that card because it's an easy card to play at this stage. Unfortunately, the problem really divides itself into two sub-problems. The emergency rule that President Sisi has now instituted is obviously one measure, one way of dealing with things. It's not clear that these sorts of solutions solve problems like the one we have emerging in Egypt. However, it's also not clear that peace can be achieved without them, at least from the perspective of security forces. What is important is to work both on the long term and the short term in all of these Arab countries with minority religious populations, be they Christians or Shia or otherwise. And by this, what I mean is genuinely developing a culture of tolerance and a culture of protection of minorities and the culture of representation of minorities. The country where I am today is an excellent example, Jordan, of leadership that really looks out for minorities, ensures that minorities are represented across government, across the public sector, and therefore protects tolerance, defends and protects tolerance, rather than just saying that tolerance is an important thing and not really doing the necessary in order to promote tolerance. And it's tolerance that prevents people from turning an event like the one we saw last week in Egypt, unfortunately, into an incident.
Florence, on that note, I wanted to ask you, because this year has witnessed terrorist attacks in Turkey, the UK, Pakistan, Russia, Egypt, and Sweden, to name just a few. Why are the terrorist attacks extending so rapidly across the globe? What can we read into the expansion of violence? You were talking about tolerance, but is tolerance the key here? Could tolerance solve the problems?
The reason why attacks are extending beyond the initial geographies when they first began by ISIS in 2014 is because they are trying to demonstrate they have international reach, and because they are being squeezed out of their initial areas of influence, as I mentioned a moment ago. What else can they do? They're trying to survive, and they're trying to demonstrate that they can survive by showing just how far-reaching their tentacles can be. Tolerance is the only way forward in the long term, absolutely. But in the short term, obviously, better security measures. And I would have very much liked to see much more strict security measures on Palm Sunday at the churches that suffered in Egypt.
Florence and Beshir, we are running out of time here. One last question, if you can. What do the latest bombings in Egypt, what kind of impact do they have on the society in Egypt? And do they weaken the powers of President Sisi? Let me start with you, Beshir.
Are angry now because they think that to a great extent the security measures and security devices didn't succeed to protect them. But I think most of the Egyptians know that Egypt is targeted from terrorism, and Christians in particular are targeted. So I think there is a good terms between Christians and the presidency, and they know well that both Muslims and Christians are both targeted from terrorism. In the future, I think there will be cooperation between the police and the military